Here is Henry Sidgwick, and as you can see, he has a very strong connection with Cambridge. Spent most of his life here. He came up as a student in 1855. By 1859, he was a fellow of Trinity College, and initially in classics before he moved over into philosophy. He became the Knightsbridge professor in 1883, co-founded what then became Newnham College, and as the author of many works, of which the Methods of Ethics, I think, is undoubtedly the most significant, and which has been described by a number of very good philosophers, including Jack Smart, C.D. Broad, and Derek Parfit, as the best book ever written in moral philosophy. I think Parfit's estimate of it is there may be some books that are more original, but the Methods of Ethics contains the most truths of any work of moral philosophy, because it was able to build on earlier works as well. Really a very important thinker, and one who I think it's regrettable is not read as widely as, for example, John Stuart Mill. If you took an undergraduate philosophy class and you were assigned a classical work on utilitarianism, I'm betting it was Mill's utilitarianism rather than Sidgwick's Methods. One obvious reason for that is that the Methods is about 500 pages, and Mill's utilitarianism is quite brief. But Mill also, I think, makes a number of mistakes, and it's very hard sometimes to work out what his consistent position is, if there is a consistent position. Sidgwick is much more careful, and for that reason perhaps his prose is also doesn't flow as well, because he makes a statement, then he hedges it with a qualification, then he considers objections, then he deals with the objections. But that's what academic philosophers do, and Sidgwick was among the first of them in moral philosophy anyway. So, there he is. And I'm going to acknowledge that what I'm saying today draws on two works that I've co-authored with Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek, one of which is and is specifically doing the kind of thing that I'm doing now, giving an exposition of Sidgwick and a defense at much greater length. This is a forthcoming book. The OUP Very Short Introduction series will be out at the end of July, and also contains some discussion of Sidgwick, although obviously much less because it's a shorter book. But these are joint works, and so what I'm saying comes out of that joint work. Right. Sidgwick is a consequentialist. That's a term that was not used in his time. But as you can see here, the account of what a consequentialist is: an action is right if its consequences are better than, or at least as good as, the consequences of any other action open to the agent. And consequences has been used to refer to different things. The classical utilitarians, for all of Bentham, Mill, and Sidgwick, refers to happiness or pleasure. Those sometimes use those terms as meaning the same. And we can call that hedonistic utilitarianism. The satisfaction of preferences, preference utilitarianism, which is a view that I have held for a long part of my career. And another possibility is what was known as ideal utilitarianism, but I think a better name is pluralistic consequentialism. That is the idea that there's not just one thing that determines what actions has the best consequences, not just one good, but more than one good that have to be in some way balanced or weighed against each other. So consequentialism is the broader family of which utilitarianism is one of the sub-positions. And when we say best consequences, utilitarians are clear that they mean best consequences for all affected by the actions. So egoism, the idea that the right action is the one that has the best consequences for me, is also a form of consequentialism. But it's not a form of universal consequentialism. It's not looking at what's the best universally. Right, so what does Sidgwick do in the Methods of Ethics? That's too big a question for me to answer in a short talk in which I also want to defend him. So I'm not going to say everything that he does, but one of the most important things that he does in Book 3 of the Methods, it's divided into 4 books and a concluding chapter, is he does a review of the morality of common sense. By the morality of common sense, he's talking about both a sort of something that was conventionally accepted, the morality that people normally talked about, non-philosophers, but it was also, there was a school of philosophy, intuitionism, which regarded this as the way to moral knowledge. So in Book 3, which if you're going to read only part of the Methods, I'd suggest Book 3 is a good place to start. He reviews the morality of common sense, as I say, and take just one example. He reviews a lot of things. Take the duty of veracity, or telling the truth. He's asking, is this duty a clear intuition which we can regard as an insight into moral truth? And he says it may seem so at first, because there are many cases where we're all pretty clear that the right thing to do is to tell the truth. But if we start looking at some of the more difficult cases, the agreement that we have starts to break down. So you can think of a range of different cases where we may not be clear about what exactly telling the truth is. For example, a lawyer who is trying to defend his client to the best of his ability. Does he have an obligation to tell the truth if he knows something which would count against his client, but he's not directly asked a question about whether to reveal that or not? Does he have to actually say the truth, or is it all right to remain silent in these cases? A different case might be where somebody who has no claim to the knowledge asks you something. For example, somebody who may be pointing a gun at you and says, have you got any jewels in your home? And you may feel that it's fine to lie in that case. There's a whole range of cases that you can describe, and that Sidgwick does describe, in which he starts to question whether we do always have an obligation to tell the truth, and the idea that we can simply refer to this fundamental intuition of truth-telling in order to decide all these cases. And his argument essentially is that what we do when we come up against the problem cases is we think about the consequences of telling the truth. And we may modify the duty to tell the truth by the idea that telling the truth would have bad consequences. So he does that then for a whole range of these intuitions of common sense morality. And at the conclusion of that review, he says, we have found that these intuitions are not really sufficiently clear and precise to stand on their own and to give us guidance in the range of cases that they appear to cover. So what we need to look for, he says, is some clearer intuitions that can lead us to truth about morality. And so what he does then in the second last chapter of Book 3 is to suggest that there are, in fact, such axioms, as he calls them, self-evident moral truths, but that they're at a more abstract level than the kinds of things he's been looking at before. And he calls them, I mean, scholars actually differ into whether they're actually 3, because some of them he gives different versions of, but I think it's simplest to think of them as 3. He calls them justice, prudence, and rational or impartial benevolence. Let's look for a moment at what they actually amount to. So the axiom of justice is the idea that whatever action any of us judges to be right for himself, he implicitly judges to be right for all similar persons in similar circumstances. When I was a graduate student at Oxford, I was a student of R.M. Hare, and Hare defended something he called universal prescriptivism, and the universalizability part of universal prescriptivism was pretty much exactly this, that if you think that something is right for someone else to do, you can't say that it would be wrong for you to do, or that would not be the right thing for you to do, if it's exactly the same morally relevant circumstances, but it's just that you're in the position of the person who was doing it before. So Hare thought that this is a truth about the meanings of moral terms. That was, I guess, coming out of the idea that the role of philosophy is to analyze analyze language, and moral philosophy to analyze moral language. But Sidgwick, as I say, thought it was an axiom of reason. He thought it was a self-evident normative truth. The second axiom of prudence is stated in a few different ways, but I think this is the most helpful way. A smaller present good is not to be preferred to a greater future good. Now, Sidgwick, of course, as I said, qualifies a lot of his statements. So he then says, allowing for uncertainty. So it's the idea of expected value here, as we now call it, that he's really talking about. That, but discounting for uncertainty, it's not rational to accept a smaller good just because it's close to us, rather than a larger good that we will receive later. So essentially this is saying all future moments are to be weighed equally, avoiding future discounting, which is an important issue in many debates, not only in terms of will you keep your appointment with the dentist, but also in such things as climate change, where some economists, when calculating the costs and benefits of certain actions relating to climate change, discount the future, not merely for uncertainty, and not merely even for the investment payoff of investing a pound today that you could get in 50 years. But they say simply because it's future, people do give less weight to the future. Some of them appeal to a kind of democratic habit, if you like, that this is what people do, so this is what we as economists ought to do. Sidgwick would certainly have had none of that. He would have thought that that was irrational to discount the future per se. And finally, and I think most importantly for our discussions, he has this axiom of rational benevolence, which actually takes a couple of steps. So you might say it's not really an axiom, since there are a couple of things that he thinks are self-evident from which he deduces the final form of it. But close enough. This is a beautifully Sidgwickian sentence, or part of a sentence, by the way. So the good of any one individual is of no more importance from the point of view, and now he catches himself saying, I'm about to say the point of view of the universe, but I don't really think the universe has a point of view, so that's why the parenthetical, if I may say so, of the universe, than the good of any other. Okay, so it's a statement that the goods of all individuals are equal, but then again he stops himself and says, well, that's not quite true, because different individuals might be capable of different amounts of good. Take an extreme case, someone with very severe brain damage, but not brain dead, might not be capable of any conscious experiences at all, and therefore their good would not weigh against the good of someone who was capable of both great happiness and great misery. And perhaps even somebody who had some dull consciousness that was capable of experiencing a dull pleasure or a dull pain would also not count the same on this view of Sidgwick's. But similar amounts of, similar capacities for good to be realized, Sidgwick says, from the point of view of the universe, they have to be given equal weight. He then says, and it's evident to me that as a rational being I'm bound to aim at good generally, so far as it is attainable by my efforts, not merely at a particular part of it. So it becomes rationally required to aim at the good of every individual in the universe as much as my own, if there are similar amounts of good. And finally then, each one is morally bound to regard the good of any other individual as much as his own, except insofar as he judges it to be less when impartially viewed, or less certainly knowable or attainable by him. So that's the final form in which he takes this axiom. And that, he then says, is the basis for some form of utilitarianism. Actually, I think it's the basis for consequentialism, though, as I said, he didn't use that term, because he's just talking about the good here, right? He's not saying what the good is. So it's certainly not utilitarianism in the classical hedonistic sense that he's going to argue for and defend. But it's an important claim, and he's also in the methods considers egoism, and he has trouble in the conflict, the contradiction between this principle and the egoist principle, but I won't go into that question here. I think you certainly get the feeling that his sympathies are with this view rather than with egoism, even though he acknowledges it's difficult to refute egoism from a point of view of pure logic or reason. Now, what about this axiom, though? I think that it's a particularly interesting claim, and one of the things that Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek and I do in The Point of View of the Universe in the book is we try to show that it's a particular kind of moral principle that is immune to an argument that Sharon Street put against realism in ethics at all. Sidgwick is a realist. He thinks that there are objective truths of reason in ethics. Street, in this celebrated article in Philosophical Studies, suggests that if we trust our sort of moral sense, our intuitions, if we think that they are a source of moral truth, we have the problem that these have been shaped by evolutionary forces. And what evolutionary forces would do, if we understand evolution right, is to give us the intuitions that would help us to survive and reproduce. That's what evolution is, the pressure that it's putting on us to move in that direction. But there's no reason to believe that the beliefs that we have if we survive to survive and reproduce, that help us to survive and reproduce, are going to be truth tracking. That is, that they are going to somehow track. If you're a realist and you think there is this objective moral truth, Street argues there's no reason to believe that your intuitions are going to take you there. She refers to that as it would be a remarkable coincidence, she says, just as if you wanted to get to Bermuda. I suppose she's thinking of starting somewhere on the US coast, but I don't know, you could start here too. You wanted to get to Bermuda, but all you did to get there was to let the winds and the currents take you. And if you did indeed land in Bermuda, you would be very lucky. It would be a remarkable coincidence. And she says if the forces of evolution had taken us to this objective moral truth, that would be a remarkable coincidence. And I think that that's a powerful argument, and I think it works against many of our common moral intuitions, that they can be given evolutionary explanations. Sometimes they can be given cultural explanations rather than evolutionary ones, but often they can be given evolutionary explanations. But those explanations then tend to be debunking explanations. They don't show, yes, so this is a moral truth because it's innate to us, because it's evolved. As Street argues, that would not be a good argument. It's rather, we think this is a moral truth, but since we know that it's a result of evolution, it's probably not. But now you think about this axiom of Sidgwick's in particular, it's telling us that we ought to give equal concern to the interests not only of ourselves, not only of our children, or our nieces and nephews, or our cousins, all of which evolution could easily explain, not even to other members of our tribal society, which with a bit of group selection, which is more controversial in evolutionary theory, maybe evolution could explain, but to complete strangers, to people on the other side of the world even, to people who are in no position to help us, to reciprocate because we help them. And it's very difficult to imagine how evolution could have led us to have any kind of innate intuition of that sort. In fact, some of the evolutionary psychologists deny that there is any universal altruism in human beings, because they think it couldn't have evolved, so it's not going to be there. I don't agree with that. I think there's lots of first-hand evidence that it does exist. Some of you may be involved in the effective altruism movement. I see a Give Well t-shirt over there. So I think the effective altruism movement has lots of people who act altruistically, and I think there are many other instances as well. You might like to read Larissa McFarquhar's book Strangers Drowning if you want some good examples. But in any case, this particular view then, if indeed it does seem self-evident, if we're inclined to think that Sidgwick was right when he said, when we look at these principles, they do seem to be in some way self-evident truths, then that's a truth, or that's an intuition that we have that is not likely to have evolved and may actually be an insight of reason rather than one of these other evolved emotional responses, kind of yuck responses that we have to various kinds of behaviour, which might be susceptible to evolutionary explanation. So if that's so, then this stands up better than a lot of other views that we might hold, and it gives us a reason for thinking that Sidgwick was onto something. Of course, it's true, somebody might say, that reason evolved as well. That's why we're able to reason, because it proved to be an advantage to our ancestors in surviving and reproducing. But the suggestion that I would make here, that we make in the book, is that yes, reason evolved, undoubtedly, but once it evolved, it gave us capacities to understand things which cut loose from the particular evolutionary purpose. So, for example, reason gave us the ability to do pure mathematics, but pure mathematics doesn't seem to have a survival value. That is, it's an ability that goes way beyond solving the problems of our survival. But once we can reason to that extent, then there are certain things that we can work out, certain things that we can see as true or prove as true. And the argument would be that something similar may happen in our capacities for moral reasoning, for obtaining moral insight, that this also may be a truth. Okay. As I said, so far we've got to the point where Sidgwick is arguing for consequentialism, but not for hedonism, not for happiness or pleasure as the only good. And he does that in the last chapter of Book 3, where he considers a variety of possibilities that might be intrinsically good, that is, good for their own sake, not good because of other consequences that they lead to. He considers, for example, knowledge and beauty. He also talks about virtue. And his argument is that, yes, these things are good, but they're good because of the effects that they have on states of consciousness. So he says, in a world in which there were no conscious beings at all, then there would not be value in there being knowledge, in perhaps in being books in which things were written down, truths were written down, but no conscious being to appreciate them. Or beauty. Actually, G.E. Moore later denied this, but I'm with Sidgwick in thinking that you can imagine the most beautiful world, if you like, all of the flowers and mountains and glaciers and sparkling lakes and so on. But if there were never going to be a conscious being that could appreciate that beauty, the world would be have no more value in it than if it were quite ugly. So, so that's the way in which Sidgwick argues, if you like. It's kind of method of considering candidates for value in isolation from consciousness and asking if we really would value them. And his answer is no, and he comes to the conclusion that the only thing that is valuable is desirable consciousness, or sometimes states of mind, as he calls it. So it's only when there is consciousness in the world that there is something of intrinsic value in it, and within the various kinds of consciousness, there are some of negative value, pain and suffering. There are some of positive value, happiness and pleasure. And he acknowledges that those terms can be quite wide and there can be very different kinds of pleasures. There can be the physical pleasure of lying on the grass out there and feeling the warmth of the sun on your back. And there can be the intellectual pleasure of understanding a complicated argument in philosophy, or better still even inventing a new argument in philosophy that you think is an important and valid argument. They're very different pleasures, or different forms of happiness, if you want to call them that. But Sidgwick thinks they're all forms of desirable consciousness, and that's really where positive value lies. So that, I'm going to say a little bit about that particular claim because it remains controversial, and as I said, it's something that I have not held throughout my career. Here's one of Sidgwick's statements of it, by the way. And the interesting thing about this statement is that he's quite explicit in not simply talking about human happiness or pleasure. As you see here, he talks about for the innumerable multitude of sentient beings, present and to come. So Sidgwick, and this he has in common with both Bentham and Mill, utilitarianism has always embraced non-human sentient beings as also beings of value, beings with who can be in positive states or can be in negative states. But here's what has perhaps been seen over the last 40 years as the most powerful objection to this view. Robert Nozick asked us in Anarchy, State and Utopia to imagine that super-duper psychologists had worked out how to connect electrodes to our brain that would give us whatever states of consciousness we wish to have. So if, for example, we would like to be a big wave surfer, we would like to surf the waves known as Jaws on the north shore of Hawaii, but we know we're never going to be capable of doing this. I'm speaking for the first person here. But it would be wonderful to have that experience. Well, so my brain could be hooked up in certain ways so that even though I was just floating in a tank, it was exactly as if I was surfing those waves. And whatever other experiences you want to have, you may say, no, I'm not that interested in that. I'd rather have that experience that I mentioned before of what it's like to discover a really novel argument in philosophy. Well, you can have the experience of exactly what it's like. We'll program you to do that. Whatever experience you want, you can have in Nozick's experience machine. And Nozick then says, okay, so given this, and given that you can dial up all of the best experiences that you'll have for the rest of your life, will you enter the experience machine? And his claim was that most people will say no to that, even though they have that. And then some of them might say, well, yes, I'd like to enter it, but it would be horrible to leave the world in the mess it's in. I feel I have a duty to contribute to trying to improve the world. And Nozick then says, well, never mind, let's assume we can provide everybody with the opportunity to enter the experience machine. Don't ask questions about who maintains it or anything like that. Just assume that that's all somehow organized. And so you don't even have that reason for not entering it. Well, this is a powerful objection, because if you are thinking to yourself, no, I wouldn't, yes, I'd love to be able to surf those big waves, or yes, I'd love to be able to discover novel arguments in philosophy, but it's not the experience of doing it that I want, it's doing it. If that's the view you have, then you would say the experience machine will not give me everything I want, and it seems as if it's not just states of consciousness, it's not just desirable consciousness that is the good, because whatever desirable consciousnesses you want, you would get. So this was one influence on me, not the only influence, I should say, but it was one influence on me thinking that preference utilitarianism might be a better alternative. So preference utilitarianism says that An act is right if no action opened. The agent would have done more to satisfy the preferences of all those affected by it. And here, as when we talk about maximizing happiness, we're deducting, in case of happiness, we're deducting the pain and suffering that might be caused by our actions. Here we're deducting the frustration of preferences that might be caused as well. And preference utilitarianism is not vulnerable to the experience machine objection, precisely for the reasons I just gave you. If you say, I don't want to just have the experience of discovering an important philosophical argument, I want to discover it, I want it to be real, then your preference is not satisfied by going into the experience machine, because you don't discover any arguments when your brain is filled with these experiences. So the preference utilitarian can say, okay, I agree, we don't want to go into the experience machine, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be utilitarians, and doesn't mean we shouldn't try to satisfy preferences as much as we can, which is not that far away from hedonistic utilitarianism. I should acknowledge, by the way, that this is the first time I've been in England since the very sad death of Derek Parfit in January, and I feel it's a great loss to philosophy and to me personally that he isn't with us anymore. But let me mention two examples that he gave in Reasons and Persons, which present different kinds of challenges to the preference utilitarian. The altruistic drug pusher is a person who addicts you to a drug which has neither harmful nor beneficial effects on you, as long as you can get another dose within 24 hours. If you can't get another dose within 24 hours, then you start to feel this craving for it, and that's a bad thing. But the altruistic drug pusher has a limitless supply of the drug, and he is going to make sure that you can get another dose of it in 24 hours. So as soon as you start to feel this desire for it, the craving for the drug, there he is with the drug, and you have it. Now, why is this a problem for the preference utilitarian? Because by addicting you to the drug, he's given you a preference which you can satisfy. Every day you have a new preference, and every day your preference is satisfied. So if we're counting the number of satisfied preferences in the world, you've now got more of them than before you got addicted to this drug. You're better off on a preference utilitarian view. But that seems a bit crazy. It doesn't really seem that you're better off if it doesn't give you any positive experiences in any way. So people then try to do things like saying, well, you don't make somebody better off by giving them a desire and then just satisfying that desire. But then you have to work out exactly how you are going to count desires, and there are various complications that can arise there. The second case is a different sort of objection. You're on a train journey, as I arrived here by train, I was one of those, and you sit next to a person who you start chatting to, and she's a very personable and interesting person that you're chatting to. She tells you about her life and about her goals and ambitions in her life, and you become drawn into her kind of narrative, and you hope very much that she's able to achieve the goals that she's just talked to you about. But her stop comes, she gets off the train, you haven't exchanged any contact details, you're never going to see her again. Still, you've got this preference that she achieves the ambitions that she described to you. And in fact, she does achieve those ambitions. Some years later, going on about her life, never encountering you again, she achieves her ambitions. Has your life now gone better? You have this preference that she will achieve her ambitions. The preference is satisfied. If you want to, if it makes a difference, you can even say you remember that preference. Every now and again you take that same train journey and you remember this interesting person who you talked to and you wonder what happened to her. And so your preference has been satisfied. Does your life go better because of that? It's a rather strange notion that it could. But a pure preference utilitarian who wants to dissociate the satisfaction of preferences from the impact on your conscious awareness is going to have to say that it does. If you start tying the satisfaction of preferences back to conscious states, you could start to get drawn into problems where the experience machine might again be a problem for you. So there are a couple of objections. But I want to mention another one, which can be expressed by this statement by John Hassani. Hassani was an economist, and many economists are in fact preference utilitarians. I think that's a kind of non-paternalist way of going about what economics is doing, maximizing preference satisfaction. And Hassani wrote a couple of articles trying to prove sort of utilitarianism based on preference satisfaction. And in fact, it's to Hassani, not to John Rawls, that we owe the idea of choosing behind a veil of ignorance. He put that in his articles before Rawls had. But he then, this is a somewhat later article, he then got a bit troubled by the idea that preference utilitarians will take any crazy preference and think it ought to be satisfied. Rawls, in fact, had an example of a crazy preference, somebody who wants to count the number of blades of grass in a lawn. That's a desire you could have. You could try, do your best to satisfy it, but would there be value in satisfying that? And if we have a choice of helping you to satisfy that preference, maybe by taking you to the particular lawn where you want to count the blades of grass, or by doing something else which would satisfy someone with what we might regard as a more reasonable preference, which should we do? Well, preference utilitarianism, strictly speaking, should be neutral between those two, but Hassani thought it shouldn't. As you see here, he thought that it was absurd to say that we have the same moral obligation to help people satisfying their utterly unreasonable wants. Now, as it happens, this is one of many instances in which Sidgwick anticipated later arguments and objections. I don't think he anticipated the experience machine. I think that might have been a step too far. But here's a passage from the Methods of Ethics, which is saying something along the same lines. And you would need to read a bit more of the context to see that is the case. But he's considering the view that a person's good, because he's discussing egoism here, so he's considering the view that a person's good is what he would desire, what he desires. And then he considers his objection that, well, he may desire things on the basis of mistaken information or on the basis of not thinking calmly and coolly about what he really wants. And so he then considers the idea that we should regard a person's good as what he would now desire and seek on the whole if all the consequences of all the different lines of conduct open to him were accurately foreseen and adequately realized in imagination at the present point of time. So this is taking being fully informed and clear-headed to its logical extreme. But Sidgwick, after considering this, then makes essentially the point that Hassani made, and that is that if a person was thinking clearly and fully informed about all of these things, then what a person would want would be whatever really was good. If there is something that is objectively, rationally good, then that would be what the person wants. So Sidgwick is arguing that if you follow this desire-based or preference-based view to its conclusion, then you come down with the idea that we should be seeking what is rationally good, not what a preference is satisfied. Okay. Can we accept, if there are these problems with preference utilitarianism, can we accept hedonistic utilitarianism and somehow overcome the experience machine objection? Essentially, can we just bite the bullet on it? Can we accept the consequences? There's a few things that have been said to explain that initial reluctance to enter into it. Why do people say no, they wouldn't go into it? Well, one might be that they've seen too many bad science fiction movies in which people go into things like this, but of course it doesn't really work out properly. Things go wrong, or they're being exploited in some way, and so that's not good. Secondly, perhaps again for evolutionary reasons, we have a sense of purpose, and we are just very committed to the idea of doing something meaningful or useful with our lives. And we can't quite get it into our heads that in Nozick's example, in a way, there are no good purposes left because everybody can enter the experience machine and have the best experiences that they possibly could. So maybe that's why we find it so difficult to think of entering the experience machine. And that's really a mistake. And thirdly, there's a bit of empirical research by someone called Philippe de Brigade, who suggests that it's the status quo bias that is preventing us going into it. The status quo bias is something that psychologists have explored in various experiments that suggests that people have a bias towards the status quo situation rather than to a new situation, which objectively speaking might be more attractive, but people will tend to choose what they have rather than a new possibility. And de Brigade asked people to imagine that they are already in the experience machine. So imagine that I'm telling you everything that's been happening to you up to now has been because you're in the experience machine, and the life that you've been leading is you're just floating in a tank and you're having these experiences programmed into you. Now, you could get out. You're going to have this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to leave the experience machine if you wish to do so. But I can't tell you anything about the external world that you'll be going into, what sort of position you will have in it, what your life will be like, who your friends will be, etc. Do you want to leave the experience machine? And de Brigade's finding, and it's not a huge sample, and I'm not saying that this is really solidly showing this, but de Brigade's finding is that people were quite reluctant to leave under those circumstances when they envisaged that. So that's supporting his view that it's because we're outside it and we don't really trust it and we don't quite know it that we're so reluctant to go into it. Now, I still find this a powerful objection, I have to say. I'm not totally convinced that I'm willing to accept it, but it's a possibility. Okay. I'm going to finish because I want to give you some question time, but one thing that I haven't talked about is the standard kinds of objections to utilitarianism. And I think before I sit down or take your questions, I ought to say something about this. So this is perhaps the classic, the forerunner of all of these objections that we've had since about the trolley problem and the transplant surgeon. Some of you who've done philosophy will know about these cases. But they're, in a way, they're variants on Dostoevsky. This is from the brothers Karamazovs, you may know. And the challenge is that to say that you're creating this fabric of human destiny. Basically, I think Dostoevsky is saying here, you're producing utopia from now on in. We're going to have peace forever. They're going to be able to rest or whatever. They're not going to have to labor, I suppose that means. So I see Ivan here. Ivan is presenting this challenge to Alyosha. I see him as saying, imagine that you can create this pretty perfect world in which all of the sufferings of human beings will be eliminated. But to do it, first you have to torture torture to death, in fact, this small child over there. Could you do it? And Alyosha says, no, I couldn't do it. And the idea is that if you're a utilitarian, you have to say, yes. Well, you don't actually have to say, yes, I could do it. You might say, what you have to say is, yes, I should do it. That would be the right thing to do. Maybe psychologically I'm incapable of torturing a child to death. I don't know. We would kind of perhaps hope that we would be. But if this is what the odds are, don't forget that if you don't torture this child to death, then wars will continue, all sorts of other things, terrorism will continue. There will be thousands, perhaps millions of children will, over coming centuries, be tortured to death by bad people. And you can prevent all of that, but you have to do it yourself to torture this one child to death. I'm prepared to say here that I think that would be the right thing to do, even though we should shrink from it. It's good that we shrink from doing that because we don't like people who are capable of torturing children to death, because obviously in the world in which we live, we don't bring about utopia by torturing children to death. Just the reverse, if anything. So it's good that we have this disposition that would make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for us to do it. But it would be the right thing to do. And as I say, that's a kind of prototype. So you can think of other objections, but perhaps you can give similar answers to them. Okay, I'm going to stop at that point. We have a little bit of time for questions. Thanks very much.